Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to pressure. As a White House spokeswoman, she had spent years navigating political storms, crafting airtight statements, and standing firm in front of relentless journalists. But on this particular morning, she wasn't in Washington. She wasn't at a press briefing or a campaign rally. She was in a small-town municipal courtroom, expecting nothing more than a quick resolution to a minor contract dispute involving her family's business. The courtroom was already in session when Karoline arrived, just a few minutes late. The judge, Edward Grayson, was known for his strict rules and no-nonsense approach. As she slipped inside, trying not to disrupt the proceedings, his gaze locked onto her like a hawk spotting its prey. "Step forward," he commanded, setting aside the case he had been addressing. Karoline walked confidently to the podium, standing tall, despite the tension in the air. "You were scheduled for the start of this session," the judge said, his voice laced with disapproval. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than this court's?" She opened her mouth to explain, but Grayson wasn't interested in explanations. His voice grew louder as he continued, berating her in front of the entire courtroom. He made it clear. Lateness was unacceptable, and in his courtroom, authority was to be respected without question. Others in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A businessman had arrived late earlier, yet the judge had barely acknowledged it. A young woman in a suit, who had also entered after the session had begun, sat quietly, unnoticed. But Karoline? She was being made an example of. "I've heard every excuse in the book," Grayson went on. "Traffic, car trouble, personal emergencies, none of that matters here. This is a court of law." Karoline remained composed, her hands clasped in front of her. She had been dismissed before, by journalists who underestimated her, by political rivals who doubted her expertise. But this felt different. This was a blatant display of bias, and she wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. The judge lifted his gavel. "This court hereby fines you $500 for contempt," he declared. A hush fell over the room. Even the court clerk hesitated as she entered the fine into the system. A few days earlier, a middle-aged attorney had arrived 20 minutes late without a single penalty. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone, except, it seemed, to Judge Grayson. Karoline took a slow breath, her mind already working. She had spent years absorbing legal arguments, studying policies, and handling crisis communications. If Grayson thought he could intimidate her, he had gravely miscalculated. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I understand the fine, but I would like to clarify something for the record." She pulled a notebook from her briefcase, the same one she had used to take notes during high-stakes White House meetings. In crisp, deliberate words, she stated her case. 7 people had arrived late that morning. 3 received no reprimand. 2 were given verbal warnings. Only 2 were fined, both young professionals. The judge's face paled. His authority, so absolute just moments ago, now seemed fragile. He fumbled with his papers, as if searching for an escape. "Miss Leavitt, perhaps we can discuss this in chambers," he suggested. "And of course, the fine is dismissed." "No, Your Honor," she replied. "Dismissing the fine because of who I am would only reinforce the bias I'm addressing. This isn't about me. It's about fairness in the legal system." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The clerk had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The bailiff, who had stood by in silence for years, nodded slightly in agreement. The judge shifted uncomfortably. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "I propose that this court review its past contempt, fines over the last 6 months. If there is a pattern of disproportionate penalties based on age or status, that needs to be addressed." The room was silent. Then, The elderly man in the gallery, who had watched Grayson for years, finally spoke. "She's right," he muttered. What started as a simple fine had become something much larger. Within hours, news of the courtroom exchange spread across social media. Reporters picked up the story. By the next day, the local news was covering it. The court was forced to release its fine records, and the truth was undeniable. Judge Grayson had a history of issuing the steepest penalties to young professionals and outsiders. Within weeks, a formal investigation was launched. Calls for judicial reform grew louder. The courthouse where Grayson had ruled for decades would never be the same. And Karoline Leavitt? She didn't just walk out of that courtroom with her head held high. She walked out having changed the system itself. The courtroom confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Judge Edward Grayson was only the beginning. What started as a tense exchange over a $500 fine quickly escalated into a full-scale investigation into judicial bias. Within 24 hours, news of the incident spread across social media. Local journalists dug into Grayson's record, and what they found was staggering. His courtroom showed a clear pattern of disproportionate punishments against younger defendants, particularly women and professionals who didn't fit his traditional mold of authority. Karoline hadn't set out to expose systemic injustice that morning, but now she had a choice: move on and let the incident fade, or use her platform to demand change. The decision was obvious. She reached out to a group of legal experts and government officials, requesting a formal review of contempt fines issued in Grayson's courtroom over the past year. The numbers painted a damning picture. Young professionals, especially women under 35, were fined an average of 300% more than their older counterparts for similar infractions. Cases involving younger defendants were processed more quickly, often rushed through with little opportunity for defense, while older individuals were given more time and leniency. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, longtime employees were beginning to speak up. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk who had hesitated before entering Karoline's fine into the system, stepped forward. She had worked under Judge Grayson for over a decade and had quietly kept her own records. In a confidential statement, she revealed a troubling pattern she had observed for years. Defendants who were older, well-dressed, or held high-ranking positions were often treated with patience and respect. Younger professionals, especially women, were frequently cut off, reprimanded, and issued the harshest fines. "I've typed thousands of case records under this judge," she admitted, "and I've seen this happen over and over again." The bailiff, Robert Hayes, had also taken notice. He had watched in silence as Grayson dismissed late arrivals from well-connected businessmen while making an example out of young defendants like Karoline. But now, with the investigation underway, he was finally ready to speak. "I knew it wasn't right," he confessed. "But what could I do? A judge's word is law in his courtroom." Grayson, now under intense scrutiny, was beginning to feel the pressure. He had been a respected judge for decades, but this scandal threatened to unravel his entire career. His initial reaction was defensive. "I treat every defendant equally," he insisted to reporters. "There is no bias in my courtroom." But the data said otherwise. By the end of the second week, the Judicial Review Board had expanded its investigation, uncovering a troubling reality. Grayson wasn't the only judge with these patterns. Other courts in the region displayed similar disparities, though none as blatantly as his. What started as a single confrontation had ignited a much larger conversation about systemic bias in the legal system. Karoline, meanwhile, was fielding calls from politicians, journalists, and civil rights organizations. The story had struck a nerve, and now people wanted her to take the fight even further. "This isn't just about one judge," she told a group of reporters outside the courthouse. "This is about how justice is applied and who gets the benefit of the doubt in our legal system." Behind closed doors, Grayson was feeling the weight of public scrutiny. With pressure mounting, he was given an ultimatum: resign quietly or face a full disciplinary hearing that could result in his removal. Karoline had exposed more than just one judge's arrogance. She had cracked open a system that had operated unchecked for years. And as the investigation continued, one thing became clear: change was coming, whether the system was ready for it or not. But the real question remained: would Grayson take responsibility for his actions, or would he fight to hold on to his fading authority? As the investigation into Judge Edward Grayson gained momentum, the pressure on him intensified. What had started as a $500 fine against Karoline Leavitt had transformed into a full-scale inquiry into judicial misconduct. The courtroom, once his domain of unquestioned authority, was now under a glaring spotlight. Public scrutiny grew fiercer by the day. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Social media exploded with discussions about bias in the legal system, with people sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment in small-town courts. Hashtags like "Marrying Grayson Exposed" and "Justice for All" trended for days. Behind the scenes, the New Hampshire Judicial Review Board pored over years of Grayson's rulings. What they found confirmed Karoline's claims. The data was undeniable. Grayson had consistently imposed harsher fines and stricter penalties on younger defendants, particularly women and those without political or financial connections. Meanwhile, former defendants came forward, emboldened by Karoline's stand. A local schoolteacher shared how she had been fined hundreds of dollars for being 5 minutes late to a hearing, while an older businessman had arrived even later the same day and received only a verbal warning. A young mother revealed how Grayson had dismissed her request for a payment plan on a traffic fine, but had granted the same request to a well-dressed retiree in the session before hers. Under mounting pressure, Grayson made his first public statement. "I have always upheld the law with fairness and integrity," he insisted in an interview. "Any claims of bias are misinterpretations of my commitment to courtroom discipline." But his words fell flat. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The judicial board gave him a choice: step down quietly or face formal disciplinary action, including potential disbarment. Grayson, once a man who commanded absolute authority in his courtroom, now found himself with no allies. The same system he had used to impose his will was now holding him accountable. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his career, he requested a private meeting with Karoline Leavitt. When she received the request, she considered it carefully. She had no personal vendetta against Grayson. Her goal had never been to take him down, only to expose the flaws in the system. Still, she agreed to meet. In a small conference room at the courthouse, the two sat across from each other for the first time since that fateful day. Grayson, no longer the imposing figure behind the bench, looked visibly aged. The stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll. "I never intended for things to escalate like this," he admitted, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I didn't see myself as biased." Karoline leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "That's the problem, Your Honor," she said. "Bias isn't always intentional, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. People trust the legal system to be fair. When that trust is broken, it affects real lives." For the first time, Grayson seemed to truly listen. "I see that now," he said after a long pause. The next morning, he submitted his resignation. The official statement cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The system had finally held him accountable. His departure sent a ripple effect through the local courts. Other judges and legal professionals took note. The incident forced a broader conversation about fairness in the judicial system, leading to mandatory bias training for judges and courtroom staff, stricter oversight on contempt fines, and new protocols ensuring that all defendants were treated equally, regardless of age or status. As for Karoline, she didn't just move on. She led the charge for judicial reform. Her experience became a case study in law schools, a testament to the power of speaking up. Months later, as she walked past the courthouse where it all began, she noticed something new, a plaque on the wall. It read, "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat every person who walks through these doors." Karoline smiled. What had started as an attempt to humiliate her had instead ignited real change. And Grayson? He had lost his bench, but in a way, he had gained something far more valuable, an understanding of the very system he once controlled. The lesson was clear. True justice doesn't come from power. It comes from accountability. And thanks to one young woman's refusal to stay silent, the system would never be the same again. Judge Edward Grayson's resignation was just the beginning. The courtroom where he once ruled with unquestioned authority was now a symbol of reform, and the effects of Karoline Leavitt's defiance continued to spread far beyond a single case. With the judicial investigation complete and the data on Grayson's biased rulings exposed, local lawmakers could no longer ignore the issue. The state legislature launched a broader inquiry into courtroom disparities across New Hampshire, uncovering troubling trends in other municipal courts. What started as an isolated incident had now evolved into a full-scale push for systemic change. Karoline, meanwhile, had no intention of letting the momentum fade. She had spent years mastering the art of public messaging, and now she used those same skills to reshape the conversation about judicial accountability. Speaking at legal panels, town halls, and even law schools, she made it clear. Grayson's courtroom wasn't unique. His was just the first to be exposed. More judges across the state came under scrutiny. Some retired quietly, sensing the change in tides. Others doubled down, defending their records against growing calls for reform. But the weight of public pressure was undeniable, and state officials were forced to act. Within 6 months, a series of new laws were introduced to address judicial bias. Mandatory bias training for judges, court clerks, and bailiffs to ensure fair treatment of all defendants. A statewide audit of contempt fines and penalties to identify patterns of disproportionate punishments. A judicial oversight committee that would review complaints against judges, ensuring accountability at all levels. The right to appeal minor fines, a measure allowing defendants to challenge fines for courtroom infractions without fear of retribution. But the real impact wasn't just in legal reforms, it was in public awareness. For decades, courtroom bias had been an unspoken reality. People accepted it as part of the system, believing that challenging a judge's authority was futile. But Karoline's case had shattered that illusion. The story continued to spread. National news outlets covered it, major legal organizations debated it, and social media platforms kept the conversation alive. Students in law schools studied it. Activists cited it in their push for broader reforms. And ordinary citizens, people who had never thought they could challenge the system, began coming forward with their own experiences of judicial unfairness. One young woman, a law student who had been sitting in the courtroom that day, wrote an op-ed titled, "I watched a judge try to break Karoline Leavitt, and he failed." In it, she described how she had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer, but had grown disillusioned by the elitism and unfairness of the legal system. Watching Karoline stand her ground had changed that. For the first time, I saw someone not just accept injustice, but fight it in real time, and win. Her words resonated with thousands. Karoline, now balancing her White House role with growing calls for judicial reform, was inundated with invitations. Universities asked her to speak. Legal watchdog groups wanted her input on their investigations. Even some young judges reached out privately, admitting that the case had forced them to reflect on their own courtroom practices. But perhaps the most surprising message came from Edward Grayson himself. Months after his resignation, he wrote Karoline a letter. "I spent years believing that my rulings were fair. I thought discipline and structure were the same as justice. But I see now that I was blind to my own biases. Losing my position forced me to confront that truth." He revealed that after stepping down, he had taken bias training courses voluntarily, not as a judge, but as a student. "I don't expect redemption," he wrote, "but I wanted you to know that your challenge made me see what I refused to acknowledge for years." Karoline never responded directly. She didn't need to. The change had already happened. One morning, she visited the courthouse where it had all begun. The doors were the same, the walls unchanged, but the energy inside was different. New policies were in place. Court clerks had undergone training. Signs now informed defendants of their rights regarding courtroom penalties. And most importantly, a culture of silence had been broken. A plaque now hung in the main hallway. It read, "Justice is not about power. It is about fairness for all who enter." Karoline traced her fingers over the words, smiling. She had not just won a courtroom battle. She had changed the system, and for every young person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced by authority, she had proven one thing. Your voice is more powerful than you think. Use it. The fight for justice was far from over, but thanks to one moment of defiance, the system would never be the same again. The courthouse battle that started with a $500 fine had turned into a nationwide conversation. What began as a simple case of judicial bias had ignited something much larger, a demand for accountability, fairness, and transparency in the legal system. Karoline Leavitt never set out to lead a movement. She was a press secretary, trained in handling crises and shaping narratives. But now, she was the story. Requests for interviews flooded in. Major networks wanted her to discuss judicial bias on national television. Universities invited her to speak on legal ethics. Activist groups reached out, hoping she would lend her voice to their campaigns for court reform. It wasn't just about Judge Grayson anymore. It was about an entire system that had operated unchecked for decades. The data from New Hampshire's judicial review prompted investigations in other states. How many judges had hidden behind their robes, using their authority to punish, intimidate, or silence those they deemed unworthy of respect? The findings were staggering. In one state, an audit revealed that younger defendants were fined at significantly higher rates for minor infractions than older individuals. In another, racial disparities in courtroom penalties were exposed, forcing a legislative response. A third investigation found that judges in small-town courts were rarely held accountable, with complaints against them frequently dismissed without review. This wasn't a local issue anymore. It was a national reckoning. Karoline knew she had a choice. She could step back, let the reforms in New Hampshire stand as her legacy, and return to her role in the White House. Or she could step forward, using this moment to push for something greater. She chose the latter. A call for change. 3 months after Judge Grayson's resignation, Karoline stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown Law School. The audience wasn't just students. Judges, attorneys, lawmakers, and activists filled the seats, waiting to hear from the woman who had taken on the system and won. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd before she spoke. "We are taught to respect the law," she began. "But what happens when the law is not applied fairly? What happens when those in power use their authority to enforce not justice, but their own biases?" The room was silent. This isn't about one judge. It's about a system that allows this to happen in the first place. If we want true justice, we need real oversight. We need judges held to the same standards as the people they rule over. We need transparency, fairness, and accountability. Applause erupted. In the weeks that followed, Karoline launched the Fair Justice Initiative, a bipartisan effort to push for reforms across the country. Its mission? Mandatory courtroom oversight and transparency annual reviews of judicial rulings to track patterns of bias. Easier access for defendants to appeal unfair fines and penalties. A national registry tracking complaints against judges, preventing misconduct from being buried. The initiative gained traction fast. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle signed on, recognizing that judicial fairness wasn't a partisan issue. It was an American issue. Meanwhile, across the country, people who had once felt powerless began to speak out. A small-town teacher shared how a judge had dismissed her in court simply for questioning a fine. A single mother revealed how she had been fined excessively, while wealthier defendants walked away with warnings. Even young attorneys admitted they had seen bias in the courtroom, but had been too afraid to challenge it. The tide was turning. Grayson's last chapter one morning, Karoline received an email that surprised her. It was from Edward Grayson. Months after his resignation, the former judge had taken a different path. Instead of retreating from public life, he had chosen to confront his own past. "I won't pretend that I wasn't resistant at first," he wrote. "Losing my position forced me to reflect on what I had ignored for years. I am now working with legal organizations to help implement bias training in courtrooms across the country." Karoline read the words carefully, considering their weight. Could a man who had once symbolized the problem now become part of the solution? She wasn't sure, but she did know one thing. Change was happening. The legacy of a moment, a year after the courtroom incident that started it all, Karoline returned to the same courthouse where she had stood before Judge Grayson. Things looked different now. New policies ensured equal treatment of all defendants. Court clerks and bailiffs had undergone mandatory bias training. Complaints against judges were now reviewed by independent committees. And hanging in the hallway was a second plaque, one placed by the people of the town. It read, "True justice is not about power. It is about fairness for all." Karoline ran her fingers over the words, the same way she had the first time she saw them. She had fought a system designed to silence her. Instead, she had changed it. And as she turned to leave, a young woman in a suit, clutching a folder of legal documents, walked through the courthouse doors. She looked nervous, determined, ready to fight her own battle. Karoline smiled, because now she knew the next generation wasn't afraid to challenge authority. And thanks to what had started as a single act of defiance, they never would be again. 1 year after Karoline Leavitt's stand against Judge Grayson, the courtroom where it all began was unrecognizable. No longer a place where authority reigned unchecked, it had transformed into a symbol of reform, a place where fairness was no longer assumed, but actively ensured. Karoline hadn't just exposed a flaw in the system, she had forced it to evolve. The Fair Justice Initiative had expanded beyond New Hampshire, gaining national traction. Several states adopted reforms inspired by her case, including stronger judicial review boards to prevent unchecked power in local courts, an appeals system for minor contempt fines, ensuring judges couldn't use penalties as intimidation, a requirement for judges to undergo bias training every 2 years, just like law enforcement officers. These weren't just policy changes. They were the start of a new standard, one where the scales of justice could no longer be tipped by ego, bias, or personal judgment. A full-circle moment. Karoline had spent the past year speaking at universities, advising legal organizations, and advocating for accountability in the courts. But one final moment would truly cement her impact. On the anniversary of the day she first walked into Judge Grayson's courtroom, she returned, this time as a guest speaker. The same courtroom that once echoed with a judge's rebuke was now filled with law students, attorneys, and even judges, eager to hear from the woman who had changed everything. She stepped to the podium and took a breath, looking out over the room. 1 year ago, I stood in this courtroom and was told that my time was less valuable than this court's. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. I was fined, not for breaking the law, but for challenging authority. But what that moment revealed wasn't just about me. It was about a system that has long expected people to obey, not question. She scanned the room. Some of the judges in attendance had once dismissed the idea of bias in the courts. Now, they were listening. That moment didn't break me, she continued. It built something new, a movement, a demand for fairness, a refusal to let authority go unchecked. She held up a document, one signed by state officials, finalizing new judicial oversight policies. The system didn't change overnight, she said, and it's far from perfect. But today, this courtroom represents something it didn't a year ago. Accountability. The audience rose to their feet. The clerk who had hesitated before entering Karoline's fine into the system wiped a tear from her eye. The bailiff who had stayed silent now stood tall, knowing that his job now had real standards. The young woman in the back of the room, studying to become a lawyer, felt something she hadn't before. Hope. The man who once held the gavel in person sat quietly in the back of the room. Edward Grayson. No longer a judge, no longer the man who commanded the room from the bench, but now a student of his own mistakes. As Karoline finished her speech and walked through the crowd, he stood and caught her eye. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. The look on his face said everything. He understood now. And that, Karoline realized, was the true victory. The legacy lives on. Months later, the Fair Justice Initiative expanded into a national nonprofit, advocating for judicial accountability in courts across America. Karoline was no longer just a White House spokeswoman. She was something bigger now, a leader in reshaping justice itself. The courtroom that once tried to silence her was now a monument to the power of standing up, speaking out, and never backing down. And on the wall of that courthouse, 2 plaques hung side by side. The first, "Justice is not about power. It is about fairness for all." And the second, newly placed in honor of Karoline's impact. A system only changes when someone is brave enough to challenge it. She had been that person, and because of her, countless others would be too.